In late 2024, DC Comics launched their All-In Comics initiative alongside announcements for a brand new set of titles with the Absolute tagline. The books were confirmed to take place in a brand new world separate from mainline DC canon and continuity, called the Absolute Universe. With the famous Scott Snyder spearheading this new universe, it was obvious this was going to be something special. When DC showed off the first look at Absolute Batman, however, it sparked some immediate controversy. From the first glance, you can immediately tell this isn't your normal version of Bruce Wayne. The biggest standout and what ultimately got the most hate was the giant bat emblem this version of Bruce was displaying on his chest. Scott Snyder, who at this point had been confirmed to be the writer of Absolute Batman, came to Twitter to explain his goal with this new version of Batman is to go big or go home. Absolute Superman and Absolute Wonder Woman were also confirmed to follow suit in the months after Batman's debut. So there was a lot of pressure on DC to make this first issue of Scott Snyder's Batman hit the right mark. The appearance of the new Batman being picked apart online continued, with memes being made about his size and overall costume design. That's not to say there weren't people optimistic for this book, especially people who knew Scott Snyder's previous Batman work. I mean, this is the man who created the Court of Owls, after all. With just a few weeks before the first issue hit shelves, DC released the first trailer for the issue, showing the first few pages of the comic book completely coloured and lettered. People immediately saw Scott's vision with this new universe. The entirety of Batman's pre-established mythos had been flipped on itself and inverted. Bruce Wayne was no longer a billionaire playboy, but a middle-class construction worker. People were shocked to see his mother, Martha Wayne, was still alive in this universe. Batman's well-known rogues like the Riddler, Killer Croc, Two-Face, and the Penguin were Bruce's childhood friends, and they all saw each other as family. The art from Nick Dragotta surpassed expectations, perfectly showing the force and strength of the Spokane Batman, as well as his brutality. The giant bat emblem that people complained about, yeah, it's an axe. His entire costume was built with everything having a purpose, which put Bruce's knowledge of engineering and chemistry in the spotlight. These first few pages really changed the majority of negative opinions on the book. Suddenly, everybody and their mama was talking about Absolute Batman. People who had never read a comic before in their life were now excited for this release. I myself started getting questions from many of my friends in real life who had previously showed no interest in comics, asking if there was any prior reading needed or where they could buy the issues from. I think the reasoning for this surge in popularity for comics in the last year is directly a result of the Absolute Universe being a true, complete start to a fresh story. Everyone will tell you that getting into comics can be overwhelming, and no one wants to be confused or read the wrong comic. There's a lot of issues out there, and for the general audience, they don't care enough to research the best exact issue number and year to start from. Even self-contained stories don't get as popular. There's still ties to the main canon, ideas cross over, origins remain the same. There isn't a definitive issue 1 of Batman. Well, not really. I wouldn't recommend the first ever issue of Batman to someone wanting to get into the character. It's like 80 years old. The general audience wants something easy with no ties that they could just jump straight into, and this is why Marvel's Ultimate Universe, the original one, that's why it did so well. Brian Michael Bendis' fresh take on Spider-Man remains one of the most highly praised Marvel comics to this day, and is constantly recommended to new readers. I think having a fresh, true, self-contained Batman comic series excited a lot of people, especially ones who had an interest in comics and weren't sure what to read. And I think that takes a big part in the Absolute Universe success. So at this point, the hype for the comic was branching beyond just normal comic readers. I saw posts on TikTok about it with hundreds of thousands of likes. That's practically unheard of for a single issue of a comic book. The hype wasn't manufactured either, because when the first issue of Absolute Batman dropped in comic stores and online on October 9th, 2024, it sold incredibly well. Hundreds of thousands of sales were recorded, with new printings being made at high demand. By the end of 2024, the first issue of Absolute Batman had sold over 400,000 copies, making it the highest-selling comic book of the year. Throughout the coming months, and as more issues released, sales didn't dwindle. In fact, the word of mouth only spread. Throughout 2025, Scott Snyder would share teasers and previews of the new takes on iconic Batman characters, showing the first look at Absolute Killer Croc, Absolute Mr. Freeze, and most famously, Absolute Bane. Every new issue was exciting and written very well. It takes hype and aura, which many people were worried this book would be, and mixes it with complex characters, emotional story beats, and engaging dialogue. It was sort of like a snowball effect, with each new issue generating a bigger snowball of conversation and relevancy. I haven't seen such a quick turnaround with merch for a comic book in my entire time in the space either. with 2 high-quality import figures on the way from their respective companies and multiple statues released already from the top statue providers. Not to mention rumours about an Absolute Batman TV series in the style of cyberpunk edgerunners. Which probably won't happen, but the fact that these big companies are talking about it means there's a market for this version of the character and his ever-evolving lore. Like I said, relevancy. DC Comics hasn't held a relevancy like this, not since the controversial New 52 initiative back in 2011, which reset the mainline DC continuity, condensing decades of stories into a much smaller time frame. Some characters got lucky, like Batman, of course also written by Scott Snyder, with his comics remaining pretty much the same with just a fresh new look and some slight changes to the previous lore. However, characters like Wonder Woman and Superman weren't so lucky, nearly being unrecognizable. All these years later, DC did what they should have done instead of the New 52. A fresh universe leads to new readers, and doesn't alienate the millions of established comic book readers by erasing their favorite characters' comics and starting from scratch in the mainline universe. This way, the pre-established world can run alongside the fresh one. At the time of this video recording, Absolute Batman issue 15 is about to hit shelves, the first appearance of Absolute Joker, and the start of a new story arc. If you're not already reading it, or you've fallen behind, I highly recommend you catch up, because these next few issues are going to be insane. Now, surprisingly, Scott Snyder wasn't originally the writer for Absolute Batman. DC originally hired Scott to just spearhead the new universe. Basically, they wanted him to be what Kevin Feige is to the MCU. He was meant to oversee the titles, make sure everything connected, and drive the new universe forward. Scott has revealed that in the beginning he planned on writing Absolute Darkseid, which would explain how the Darkseid from the mainline universe created the Absolute universe. And it's really confusing, but there's a whole reason for that. Another story Scott claims he was thinking about was an Absolute Detective Chimp book. Scott basically wanted to take a step back and just write a book on the sidelines, letting other creatives have a go at the big titles while he just made sure the books ran cohesively and alongside each other. But DC was pressuring Scott to find these writers fast, aiming for a late 2024 release window for the start of the new comic line. Superman eventually found his writer with Jason Aaron, who had previously worked on titles such as Thor for Marvel Comics and Superman's Action Comics with DC. Wonder Woman was given to award-winning writer Kelly Thompson, which excited a plethora of people in the world of comics. The mainline Wonder Woman run was, and still is, borderline slop, written by a war criminal who uses the book to write propaganda for the US and its military. So, naturally, a good writer on a fresh take of Wonder Woman was very much welcomed within the comic space. But anyway, DC still needed their Batman writer, as he's the highest selling character they have. Scott made an outline, a basic pitch of a simple story for what Absolute Batman could be, and he shared it with other writers, attempting to find someone who would do justice to the character. Scott made this pitch strictly as an example, just so people could get an idea of what they were looking for. But as time went on and pressure started growing, James Tynion called up Scott, claiming to have found his new writer for Batman. As Scott quotes, he was like, "I have someone for you to do Absolute Batman." And I was like, "Who?" And he was like, "You idiot." And thus Scott finally agreed to take the reins of the main book, and the rest is history. On the 23rd of August 2025, Scott Snyder and his creative partner Nick Dragotta announced that the first 35 issues of their run were fully planned out. So there's no sign of this run ending anytime soon. And unlike Marvel, who cancelled their new Ultimate Universe despite its great sales, DC actually likes money. I wouldn't be surprised if Absolute Batman goes for 100 issues, and I hope it does. Having this much discussion around comic books is surreal, and a step in the right direction for the industry. And with that said, I'm going to close out the video. This is my first time making a video of this length, so I'd appreciate a like. That way, YouTube will boost it and more people will hear about this great comic book. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.